Uniquely.
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 Issaquah.
Hi, welcome to another edition of Uniquely Issaquah, where we talk about the people, places, and things that make Issaquah unique. Today, I have Ken Konigsmark, a recent inductee into the City of Issaquah's Community Hall of Fame. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
First off, I just want to maybe tell people a little bit about what the Hall of Fame is. You know, there's many people over years and years have shared their passion, their time, and their effort to make our community a better place. And for that, we want to recognize those names and let people know about it. So, Ken, congratulations. 2023, you're our inductee.
Thank you. It's an honor.
I wonder if you could maybe start out today by telling me and our audience, how did you end up in Issaquah?
Sure. I was fresh out of the Army in 1984 at Fort Lewis, knew I didn't want to leave this area, and I had gotten a job offer from Boeing. And so I started looking. I lived out in Yelm at the time because I like country living and I like trees and mountain views. And I started looking in Kent and Renton and places like that, and I just couldn't see myself fitting in there. So I finally stopped for lunch at a Burger King and asked the clerk, where would you live if you could live anywhere around here? And she said, I'd go to Issaquah. And I drove up SR 900 between Cougar and Squaw Mountains with the beautiful drive. I came down onto Newport Way looking at Tiger Mountain, and I knew that this is where I was going to live. And I've been here since '84.
Oh, we are so lucky. Big thank you to that lovely lady at Burger King. Awesome. I want to talk a little bit about those hills that you just mentioned. Yeah. I mean, one of your passions has been the forested hillsides that make Issaquah such an amazingly beautiful destination or a place to live. But when you were starting to get involved, there's a lot going on, and this is how I came to learn about your work and your advocacy. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what was going on in the 80s and 90s when you first got here?
Yeah, well, first, there was very little protected at that time, and thank goodness the Issaquah Alps Trails Club, founded in 1979 by Harvey Manning, who lived up on Cougar Mountain, began the campaign to first call these the Issaquah Alps, which a lot of people laughed at. Like, what are these Issaquah Alps? Now, it's a well-known, treasured icon of a name. But Harvey started pushing the King County Council first on Cougar Mountain Park. And amazingly, with Randy Revelle as county exec, they did make the first purchases to create Cougar Mountain Regional Wildland Park. That then led to the Bullitt family, of the Bullitt Foundation, who owned a square mile up on Squaw Mountain, to come to the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and say, we'll donate our square mile of land if you can get state parks to accept it under conditions that it be treated essentially like wilderness. Of course. And then Harvey pushed Weyerhaeuser, who owned all the land on Tiger Mountain, to make a trade with State Department of Natural Resources, and that led to State DNR becoming the primary owner on Tiger Mountain. And little by little then, for the decades that followed, there's been purchase and campaign after campaign to buy up all the remaining parcels we could to create what is now over 20,000 acres of protected forest land around Issaquah. That's unheard of.
It is. I mean, it absolutely is one of the reasons why my family has arrived in this area, never left.
Yeah.
But I think there's huge misconception that if you see trees, it must be publicly protected land. A lot of that work really got done in the late 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, if people don't understand, every piece of land first has zoning attached to it. Even out in the Alpine Lakes wilderness, the zoning would say you can build one home per 80 acres on that forest land, even in the middle of wilderness. Bring it closer to us. Out in rural King County, lands are zoned from one home per 5 to 20 acres. Bring it into the city, and it's much denser. And that's why, under the State Growth Management Act, we created a urban growth boundary, which is right along the edge of Issaquah Highlands and Issaquah, to make sure that this sprawl doesn't go out further to the east. And luckily, we've held that line since 1990.
Right. That is one of the most fascinating government actions I ever saw, coming from urban cities elsewhere where farmland was always getting developed with new housing tracts. I love explaining to people that some special big decisions and actions were taken way back. Also, it goes on today, like you said. Susan Neville and the Save Cougar Mountain crowd helped to get a piece of Bergsma property, another historic family in the valley, preserved as open space as well, in a multi-part deal with Trust for Public Lands and King County, and we're still doing it. We're still doing that today.
All those efforts have not ended. There is always, first, people need to recognize, even if protected, that doesn't mean the land is risk-free. For example, Tiger Mountain. People think it's a park. It's a state forest that under DNR's management must be managed to produce revenue for schools and universities, the Capitol building, things like that. That there's an exception on the front side facing Issaquah, which is designated a natural resource conservation area, which doesn't have to be logged over about 4,000 acres, as I recall. But the rest of Tiger Mountain is to be managed as working forest land to produce revenue for schools. So people shouldn't get upset when they see that and understand that if you didn't have that forestry activity, growing, managing, cutting some trees, it'd be covered in homes, and you'd have no forest left.
Yes, it would. I mean, I think one of the most interesting projects that were going on at the time that I arrived were two new major hillside developments. One on Cougar Mountain, originally called East Cougar Mountain Village, and then one up in what we now call the Highlands. It was called the Grand Ridge, and those were very interesting conversations, and you had a big part in them. So why were you so interested in those two areas?
Well, I knew the Grand Ridge landscape, first of all, which was huge, old, beautiful trees. I mean, you're talking 100 to 200 years old at least, and some are older than that. Prime wildlife habitat. And the biggest danger that most people don't understand, that it wasn't even controlled by the city at that time. All of that land that is now Issaquah Highlands was in rural King County, zoned for one home per 5 acres. And so the worst outcome would have been on the 2,200 or so acres, having 500 or so mega mansion estates, each with their own well drilled into the aquifer, each with their own septic system draining sewage into the aquifer, no habitat left, no public land, no trails. And so I and several others advocated for something better. And give Gary Locke credit, give the mayor of Issaquah, Ava at that time, I believe, was instrumental in putting together a 3-party deal that was called the 4-to-1 program, meaning for every 4 acres that the developer, Port Blakely, donated to King County Parks, they would get 1 acre of intense urban development zoning. So you shrunk the footprint of the development to 20% of the land and preserved 80% of it as it was forever at no cost to the public. I don't think you can get a better outcome than that. And the other added benefit, that instead of 500 mega mansions, you got about 4,000 residential units up there now to take to help our growing population have places to live.
Yeah. I mean, that was very intriguing for me as an outsider first coming to town to understand the complexity of that deal. And for those folks that live there now, it can be one of our most affordable neighborhoods because Port Blakely also included that kind of requirement in their from their builders, which was, at the time, amazing. It would be great today if I could still get those kinds of development agreements through. So that was fantastic. And I don't think everybody realizes when they see the trees how that happened. Kind of a different story on Cougar Mountain, though. I mean, every space in town has its own little story.
Yes, there's a story behind every piece of land that was conserved or developed. And most of the battles were won, a few were lost. We did win on East Cougar. The Talus development, I think, is another shining example of a success. And again, it was 650 acres that most people don't know, went way up the side of Squak Mountain to the edge of the state park, too. That land crossed 900, went up the slope of Cougar, owned by Intracorp at the time. And luckily and fortunately, again, based on the history of what had happened in Issaquah, they came to town saying, we only want to do a development if it's not going to create a big backlash. So what do we got to do? And the city planning department, Mark Hinthorn, told them, well, the first thing you should do is go meet with Ken, representing Issaquah Alps and the Mountains to Sound Greenway, Joanna Bueller of Save Lake Sammamish, and find out what their concerns are so you don't run into a bunch of backlash and problems. And we told them, we don't want any development south of West Fork Tibbetts Creek because that's sensitive. We also want a connector between Cougar Mountain Park and Squak Mountain State Park so the wildlife have a corridor. And this one from Joanna created a stir when she said, and we want a net improvement in downstream water quality even after you build 15 or 1,800 new homes up there. And their CEO of Intracorp, Mike Miller, said, we can do that. And his consultants were, Mike, be quiet. And they did do it. And their answer to doing that first was very good stormwater treatment systems combined with their self-funded effort to restore an old coal mine along Tibbetts Creek that was sloughing off tailings from the former coal mine into the creek every winter, polluting downstream into Lake Sammamish, and they completely restored and fixed that tailing site as a contribution to downstream water quality. So again, in that case, the public ended up with about 450 acres of donated public land protecting those creeks that was given to us by the developer in exchange for denser development on what is now Talus.
That's amazing. You bring me to sort of my next whole series of questions, which has to do with what happens with all that amazing open space when we have it. And so how about we talk a little bit about the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and how you got involved with the Mountains of Sound Greenway.
Okay. Well, let's start with Issaquah Alps Trails Club, founded by Harvey Manning. For those that may not know, he was one of the original hiking guidebook authors. He and Ira Spring did the 100 hikes in the North Cascades and the Alpine Lakes. Both are now deceased, unfortunately, but they were legends in their time. And Harvey started the club along with another Hall of Famer, Dave Kapler.
Yes.
Goes way back to the beginning. And there's been a whole cast of people for 40 years that have dedicated so much time and effort to really amazing results on the ground. And I ended up in a roundabout way joining that club because I lived in Issaquah up on Squak Mountain and I hiked in the state park. I didn't really want to be part of any group. I was busy at work. I liked to hike by myself. But at that time, in the late 80s, there were four-wheelers and motorbikes and everything trespassing into the state park. In the worst case, cutting corridors up from State Route 900 through the forest and winching themselves up and creating massive ruts, polluting the creek. And I kind of went to war, being fresh out of the Army, and was battling them in my own ways until one day, 8 Jeep loads of them came down a trail in the state park, and I stopped them and I said, "What are you doing?" And they all jumped out, surrounded me, threatened to beat me up. And that's when I knew I couldn't do it by myself. And I went to the next Issaquah Alps board meeting, and within a month they made me president.
President, of course.
Which, again, I didn't really want, but it's a good thing that happened because that laid the groundwork to get more involved on everything from conservation to land use to growth management. And then, the best of all, that led to, in 1993, my employer Boeing agreeing to loan me out full-time to the Mountains to Sound Greenway project as part of their community giving program. And that was meant to be a 2-year assignment, but we finagled that into a 10-year stint of my career, paid by Boeing to work full-time on Mountains to Sound Greenway.
So tell me a little bit more about that. I moved here in 1993, and that is right around the time that all of this started. And today, it's just, to me, a really inspirational story of what we can do.
Again, I don't know of any place in the world that's had the foresight and the follow-up action to do what the Greenway, and when I say Greenway, I mean all the partners. It's governments, it's public agencies like State DNR, Forest Service, city parks. It's corporations, whether it's Boeing or Microsoft, all have contributed. It's strange bedfellows like Weyerhaeuser and Plum Creek on one hand, sitting down with Sierra Club at a Greenway board meeting and breaking bread together. But by doing that, what everybody could agree on was nobody wanted to see the I-90 corridor turn into another giant urban mess, which interstates tend to create, like I-5 is pretty much from Vancouver to Portland now. And I-90 was set to become the next place that would happen, because where else could Seattle grow? Eastward along an interstate. And again, between the Growth Management Act that drew a hard line, urban growth at the edge of Issaquah, period, stop. And then the Greenway saying, that's good for now, but we can't be sure that'll hold forever, so let's be sure we buy up the land along I-90 and beyond to create a green corridor stretching all the way from Ellensburg over the Cascades to the waterfront in Seattle. And the stories and success of that effort are legendary.
They are. It is quite amazing, and there are so many trails. I wrote a piece of it in Seattle the other day when I was going over to Bremerton, and I just think it's just such a cool story. There was also a big kickoff to that, a hike. Were you part of that hike?
I was not. I was working. I knew of it,
oh, that was
but I thought,
cool.
I can't take 5 days. This is in the days when you only had 10 days of vacation a year.
Yeah.
And but Dave Kapler, another Hall of Famer, was on that hike, along with Doug McClelland, who worked for State DNR for 37 years in our area. And you did get people like Gary Locke joining in. You got Rod Chandler, who was our congressperson at the time. And that effort in 1990 was what kicked off the whole Mountains to Sound Greenway effort. It was led by the Issaquah Alps Trails Club, and it almost broke the club to have arranged and coordinated and funded that event. But about 80 to 100 people walked from Snoqualmie Pass all across the Greenway corridor, Rattlesnake Mountain, up and over Tiger, Squawk, and Cougar, and down to the waterfront in Seattle to highlight and point out that we still have this green landscape, but if we don't act now, we're going to lose it. And it did bring that attention and the press to that, as well as the political leaders who said, you're right, we got to do something. And then fortunately, a civic legend, Jim Ellis of Preston Gates and Ellis law firm, who also brought the convention center to Seattle, who cleaned up Lake Washington back when it was a sewage cesspool in the 50s. Civic legend agreed at age, I believe it was 73 when he became president of the Greenway. And he's the one, too, that then rallied corporate, political, agency support behind this effort that kicked off what is now going on 30 years. Yeah. 30 plus years of success.
Just a fabulous story. And one thing that is so unique about that story is the value of partnerships, of having the strangers at the table, of breaking bread with people and having conversations before you have disagreements.
Yeah.
That's kind of the magic sauce, I think, for the Mountains to Sound Greenway, that they were able to do that and continue to do that.
Yes, I would agree. There's a couple things within that. Collaboration is one, and even if you don't agree, it's okay. Sit down, talk about it, see if there's a middle ground, and go back and forth until we can find it. I wish our politics were like that more today, back in the day when they used to be. The other thing, beyond collaboration, is what I'd call pragmatism, that you can be idealistic about a lot of things, like we should never cut another tree, or let's save every bird that flies. Of course we'd love that in an ideal world, but it's not an ideal world, it's a realistic world, and we have to come up with pragmatic solutions that say, in the environment we're surrounded in, what's the best thing we can do? What's the best outcome we can get? And that leads to things like the 4-to-1 deal on Issaquah Highlands and Tallis, where you at least saved 80% of the land while providing needed housing and benefits to the community.
Yeah, in an urban style, which is appropriate to do on such a smaller footprint. I think recently, Ken, of the work that was done, Weyerhaeuser still owns some land at the crest of Tiger Mountain, and people now can see that that was logged. But there's a story behind that.
Yes.
What did Weyerhaeuser, where did we start off and where did we end there? Because that for me is just a modern day example of that collaboration that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, back in the early 80s, Weyerhaeuser owned all of Tiger Mountain, pretty much. And they could do forestry. The city, by the way, owned 400 acres. Most people don't know. 400 acres of the Tradition Lake Plateau is owned by the city. And I must give the city credit for consciously voting to put that into a conservation status, because there was talk about maybe we should develop up there, maybe we should put homes around the lake and make money for the city. No, the city had the courage to conserve it, thank goodness. But Weyerhaeuser owned most of Tiger Mountain, and Harvey got, at the time, the State Lands Commissioner Brian Boyle to come up, walk around Tiger, create what they called a forest in an urban setting. And nobody knew what that meant, but it meant DNR was going to invest in King County, an urban area, when all of their logic said, go buy land in Pacific County, far away from anybody. No, they chose to invest here because of the push of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and the sense it made to help protect this landscape. And then over time, as Weyerhaeuser sold different portions or traded to state DNR, they retained 90 acres at the top because of the radio towers that are up there that
are visible,
and they produce revenue. They have an annual or monthly fee for using that land for those towers. So it's a moneymaker for Weyerhaeuser. But as the trees grew up and their customers complained, they needed to cut the trees to allow those signals to still work. And that created a little controversy, like, what are you going to do, Weyerhaeuser? And in the end, it worked out well, because while they did cut the trees, those trees can grow back. In the meantime, it opened up beautiful views that had been lost too. And the outcome too is that state DNR will end up owning that land in the future.
Goodness, right.
So that it'll be consistent ownership across all of Tiger Mountain now.
Yeah, I thought that was fabulous. I have hiked up there. I have seen the views. I have seen where the new suggested trails can go and watched as they've replanted it. So that is just an interesting story. You know, without a local paper, I'm going to have to keep interviewing you over and over again to make sure the stories get out. Well, Ken, those are just a few of the reasons why you were selected for the Hall of Fame. And I'm really excited tonight that we're going to have many of our Hall of Fame recipients there for a reception. Glad you're going to be there. Is there anything else that you want to tell our audience that maybe they don't know about you, Mr. Konigsmark?
Oh, about me. Let me see. How about Issaquah and how lucky we are to live where we live? Everybody should very much appreciate where we are, what we have. I also give credit to our elected officials who, over my almost 40 years now in Issaquah, have been superb.
Yeah.
If there were someone who was a dud, I'd call them out, as you well know, and I would.
Yes.
But I won't, because there aren't any. They've all been superb across the board, whether it's council, mayors, city staff. We've been so blessed. Then we live in this magical place. And, you know, Money Magazine at one point named Issaquah one of the best places to live in the country. And I'm like, shh, don't tell anybody. But it's true, and we don't want that spread too far. But at the same time, we've got forested hillsides. We've got 20,000 plus acres of public land. We got, let me think, we've got probably 150 miles of trails around us. We've got wildlife. We've got salmon still swimming up the stream to Issaquah. what more could anybody want?
Right. It didn't happen by accident.
No.
Thank you for giving credit to all the community members, the elected, the city staff we have, the city staff we used to have, because I think we've been going down this path for quite a while.
Yeah.
So anyway, lovely to have you today, Ken, and congratulations on your award.
Thank you. It's an honor.